Bullfrog Productions were well known for developing highly experimental, slightly offbeat games. They've had a great deal of influence with games like Dungeon Keeper, Theme Hospital and Magic Carpet, and while the company has shut down and the series they developed are mostly consigned to the IP vaults at EA, their influence on the industry both directly and in studios founded by their alumni continue to this day. Their third release, Populous, was one of the earliest examples of God games. Meanwhile, Power Broker took similar mechanics and tightened the focus from a world to a nation. Their cyberpunk real-time tactical action game, Syndicate, would narrow that focus even further to individual cities. Often conversations around Syndicate reference it in a similar way to the original XCOM. The theory goes that they're both games featuring tactical combat within the frame of a strategic management layer, but the similarities are less pronounced than I was led to believe. Syndicate's strategic layer is far simpler than it would seem. Managing your agents, research division, and the tax rates of individual regions seems complex at first, but the truth is it has less impact on the overall game than it appears, and the structure is far more forgiving than it implies. Early on, resources are difficult to come by, and deciding upon which research to embark upon seems impactful, but in reality, the relative ease of the more action-focused segments gives you a lot more leeway than you would think. While getting the right research early will certainly help matters, there's rarely going to be a situation where you are hamstrung by an earlier decision, especially since save-scumming before missions and repeating it until you make it through with all your agents intact is always an option. Your other option for making things easier is the simple fact that research and income happen in real time, not just advancing during missions, but between them as well, meaning in a pinch you can just leave the game running on the map screen and wait for more money to come in or more research to finish. The punishment for mismanaging your corporate empire isn't too dire either. Setting a tax level too high for long enough to anger the populace of a region only results in you replaying the mission assigned to that region, and since your squad is likely to be better equipped by that point, it's more of a light slap on the wrist than an actual punishment. This isn't to say the strategic layer is bad, however. Personally, I find these kinds of elements rather stressful, knowing that if I pick the wrong research now, it may make my game impossible to complete several hours from now isn't a particularly fun time, but I know other people find these kinds of mechanics far more engaging and may be disappointed by the simplicity of it. Either way, the strategic layer does more for the game's feel than its mechanics. Letting you expand in the direction you want, having these decisions even if they aren't particularly impactful, it all works to give the sense of managing a corporate hit squad between missions, selling the fantasy better than a simple back-to-back sequence of levels would have, even if it's the missions themselves that are going to make up the bulk of the playtime and engagement. The moment-to-moment gameplay within missions is pretty original, even by today's standards. Tactical gameplay often focuses more on turn-based play, such as XCOM, but Syndicate ups the pressure with real-time controls, so while it's still about coming up with an overall plan and then making adjustments on the fly as that plan goes wrong, snap decisions and reflexes are more important than agonising over the optimum approach. Uncommon as real-time tactics are now, they were even more unusual at the time. Larger-scale real-time strategy games hadn't quite taken off yet, with Dune 2 having only come out the year prior and Warcraft and Command & Conquer yet to be released. The closest analogue in terms of gameplay would strangely be Cannon Fodder, which came out earlier in the same year, and was more of an action-focused title. Unfortunately, as original as the gameplay was, and engaging as it is, its earliness in the genre lets it down across the board. I don't want to be harsh on the game. It's good, I had a good time with it. It does deserve recognition and respect, and is even worth playing, but almost every aspect of its gameplay is let down by some level of jank, where the ideas driving the design couldn't quite live up to the mechanics and technology necessary to execute them. This doesn't just detract from individual elements, but alters the optimal way to play the game in a way that, ironically, pushes it more into the action-oriented Cannon Fodder-esque gameplay than the more thoughtful, tactical gameplay that seemed to be intended by its design ethos. Even basic elements such as controls and interface have an effect on this. There's a noticeable delay to every input. To be fair, I can't tell if this is a problem with the game itself, or the nature of needing to emulate it through DOSBox, but whether or not you select one of your 4 agents with the number keys or your mouse, there's a noticeable delay before you can actually issue them with commands, slowing your ability to give orders considerably. Most things you might want an agent to do won't have a hotkey either. It's all mouse controls, which adds to how difficult it is to give orders quickly. The result is that you're likely to be able to think far more rapidly than you can translate those thoughts into instructions, and will end up stumbling over yourself to react to changing circumstances. This difficulty in giving your agents orders is made worse by the pathfinding. There's no direct feedback as to where your agents think you just clicked for them to go, and the pathfinding is very rudimentary. Units on both sides of the fight will regularly struggle to navigate, opting to take a straight line to their target and following walls in circuits until they reach it. In simple areas this can work fine, but any geometry more complex than basic square buildings will trip them up and make navigation difficult. The combination of sluggish controls and the fact that you can't trust them to go where you want without micromanaging them means complex tactics and separating your squad are far too difficult to execute, leaving you better off relying on grouping all 4 of your agents and moving them as a singular unit, making sure to never send them too far lest they get confused and try and split up. This severely limits the tactical options available to you. Since you can only group all your agents or control one at a time, you can't even split them into 2 teams particularly well. One tactical option available to you involves the drug system. Each agent can be administered doses or deficits of 3 drugs: adrenaline, perception, and intelligence. This lets you alter how each agent performs and reacts when left to their own devices. Adrenaline affects reaction time and movement speed, perception how far they can see, and intelligence how they respond to threats. You can change these on the fly to suit the mission's needs, drop perception and intelligence while boosting adrenaline to make an agent that will fly through an area ignoring enemies, boost perception and adrenaline while dropping intelligence, and they'll stand their ground firing on enemies, never retreating. It's a great idea with a lot of potential, but like the general controls, is hampered by its execution. Adjusting them on a per agent level with the mouse is fiddly, but the real problem is how long they last. Agents will quickly adapt to a higher or lower level of each drug, returning them to normal operations and limiting the effect you can get from administering the same dose again. This means that if you want to leave 3 agents on Overwatch and use a third to bait opponents into a trap, you don't have a lot of time to execute the plan before your agents return to normal, made more difficult by how fiddly it is to move that agent quickly. This flattens all the tactical possibilities of the system back down to using it in its simplest way. Group your agents, drop all 3 stats as low as possible when outside of combat, hit the panic key when you meet an enemy to max out all 3 drugs and auto-equip their best weapon. The panic key is one of the only hotkeys available to you, conveniently activated by hitting both mouse buttons, so it's the only tactical option you have quick access to, and since it's a good enough tactical option in almost every situation, it will end up being the one you rely on for the vast majority of the game. This is a real shame because there are, on paper, a huge amount of weapons and equipment to play with, but they'll usually end up less effective than the far simpler alternatives. Rocket launchers for taking out groups, timed explosives for laying ambushes, even energy shields that make your agents immune to damage for a while at the expense of not being able to shoot, but still able to self-destruct. All sorts of weapons and tactics are possible, but few are as universally effective as setting up a 4-man squad with miniguns and hitting panic whenever the music switches to the combat theme. When the game first starts, it seems overly simplistic, just move and shoot. Then, as you unlock more equipment and grow to understand the drug system, a world of tactical possibilities opens up to you, only to realise that you were basically right from the start. It gives the game a strange curve, difficult at first, growing into an exciting early game as you experiment with different tactics, and then it starts to drag when you realise the majority of its missions are going to end up looking rather similar. This doesn't mean the game is necessarily easy throughout. Missions do have a variety of objectives, some more irritating than others. Your basic assassination missions and combat sweeps are pretty straightforward. Persuade missions are a little trickier with you having to watch your fire around your target, though it's usually easy enough to clear the map first and then grab them. The most difficult missions tend to be more complex, though they are few and far between. Escort missions are obviously the worst, where the NPC's pathfinding will take them on the most circuitous route, often right into the path of mines that the enemies frequently drop. But even beyond that, there will be specific missions throughout with wrinkles that complicate things. assassinations with short extraction times, combat sweeps where you need to keep a vehicle intact to access areas of the map, or capture missions where the enemy is trying to kill them. There are several missions throughout which will take several shots at completing through no fault of the players, and that's without just getting unlucky. Even fully upgraded, your agents are rather squishy and stun easily, so even a small mistake can quickly lead to a squad wipe. You start the game with 8 agents, and if they all die, the campaign is over. Failing because your escort target walked into an IED isn't really a problem, since you can start again with a little extra cash and research done, but losing a full squad can hurt. You either need to reload your save or re-equip a new squad if you have the money, but you'll also need to recruit extra agents, the best way to do so being to abuse the poor AI. Syndicate doesn't have a great deal in terms of narrative. The manual features a brief outline of the world and humorous dossiers on your rival syndicates, but in-game there's never an indication which syndicate you're facing at any given time, and there's never any motivation given beyond conquest. The one relevant piece of narrative is the chip. Everyone has one. It connects individuals to the various corporations, keeps track of them, alters their perception of the world, and most importantly for the player, lets you hack into them and take control. Equipping an agent with a Persuadertron and walking them near to any NPC can bring them over to your side, following that agent until death, even picking up abandoned weapons and fighting beside you. Civilians will always be controlled. Police and guards and enemy agents require you already have an increasing number of others already following you. Anyone still under your control at the end of a mission will net you bonus funds, but enemy agents you persuade will be added to your roster instead. The result is that the most effective way to rebuild your stores of agents is to grab a bunch of civilians off the street and then hide around a corner. The Persuadertron doesn't have much range, but the enemy pathfinding makes it predictable and exploitable enough that you can be pretty sure that if you bait them in correctly, entire armies of enemy agents will walk right up to the corner and immediately join your side as they turn it. Completing a mission without firing a shot and a conga line of enemy agents in tow is pretty funny. It's also handy that any number of them can fit into vehicles. It's like everyone owns a clown car. Not just because of how many people can fit in them, but because vehicles pathfinding is even worse than the pedestrians. The cities you'll be performing these missions in are beautifully realised for the time. The pixel art streets and blocks, as well as the characters that inhabit them, manage to evoke a dark and grim industrial future while still being colourful and lively. The environments have unique layouts that affect the structure and feel of a mission. Obstacles like rivers, vehicle gates, and even rail lines block off parts of the city, affecting how you approach the missions, but that variety is lacking when it comes to the visuals. Broadly speaking, there are 2 major styles of city, regular and floating. The floating cities are made up of narrow walkways between squares of buildings, with regular cities having more traditional block-based layouts. The styles play and appear different enough from one another, but within each style there's frequent reuse of buildings and structures, so even when the specific composition changes, they can start to feel a tad repetitive at times. The gameplay also can't handle the dense layouts all that well. In order to accommodate the camera, there are none of the kinds of high-rise buildings that you might commonly associate with futuristic cityscapes. You can't rotate the camera at all, meaning you're reliant on your radar to tell you the positions of you or your enemy's agents when they're behind buildings, or worse, inside them. Sending your squad into a building is mostly a case of drugging them up to act on their own and hoping that they can manage to clear it themselves, since you can't see inside and will have to wave your cursor around blindly to find enemies within them. When the zones do introduce multiple levels of verticality, such as catwalks, rooftops, or god forbid underground tunnels, the imprecise navigation and pathfinding are particularly susceptible to breaking down as well. Despite difficulty with navigating, however, the levels are still a triumph of giving the player a small open world to cause chaos in, which can end up feeling like something of a precursor to the chaos-driven sandboxes that would later be popularised by games such as Grand Theft Auto. You can tackle these missions in almost any order. Lacking any narrative beyond the need to paint the world map your corporation's colour, you start out in Europe and then each mission you complete lets you tackle the missions in any of the neighbouring zones. This quickly leads to you being able to advance on multiple fronts as you see fit, leaving difficult missions until later if you're struggling with them. This flexibility is nice, but there are more missions than the game's content can really handle. Given the deceptive simplicity of the research tree and how quickly you accrue money as the game progresses, you're likely to have maxed out your research tree after a few continents. By the time I'd run out of research to perform, I still had the entirety of North and South America to conquer, and the non-linear nature of your conquest means there's little in the way of balance with regards to mission difficulty. The first few in Europe slowly escalate in difficulty, as well as introducing the more common mission types, but once you can advance in any direction of your choosing, the missions are going to be a similar difficulty everywhere. This is likely to lead to you steamrolling the back half of the game pretty easily, until you accidentally drive that steamroller off a cliff. While you're likely to unlock it somewhere around the midpoint of a playthrough, there's one mission that is clearly intended as the finale. The brief ending sequence, which just consists of standard mission completes cutscene but with credits this time, will play once you finish the entire map, but it's clear that the Atlantic Accelerator, an artificial research platform in the middle of the Atlantic, is intended as the game's mechanical climax. Even with a fully equipped, maxed out squad, you're likely to get instantly wiped out by a huge wave of enemies that attack as soon as the mission starts. Even once you manage to survive the opening salvo, you're treated to a long, painful process of cheesing the NPC's pathfinding into a series of kill boxes, where a single slip-up will likely wipe your squad and require a restart. It's a massive challenge, but not a particularly engaging one, since the narrow walkways mean completing it relies more on abusing the game's systems rather than tactical ingenuity or skill. It also ends in a weird pseudo-boss fight, a single beefed-up agent in a building, a surprisingly irritating final encounter, given you're at the mercy of whatever's left of your squad's AI to kill them for you, and getting unlucky means repeating the entire mission. Syndicate was a massively ambitious game, and I don't think it quite managed to pull off what it wanted to. That's not to say it's bad, though. The clunky controls and unclear feedback make tactical engagements difficult to execute, but the mission structure and pathfinding often make those tactics unnecessary in the first place. As a real-time tactics game with a strategic layer, it falls short, but as a chaotic action game that requires just a little more thought than normal, it's a pretty good romp. The concept is sound and very much ahead of its time, but the execution, mostly due to technical limitations, needs a little more work. It would come closer to the promise of its concept though, through its sequel, but we aren't quite finished with the original just yet. Released the same year as the base game, and later bundled as part of Syndicate Plus, American Revolt is a kind of expansion we don't really get anymore. With the exception of games already marketed upon their difficulty, expansions and DLCs these days usually come in somewhere in the middle of a base game's difficulty curve, or if it does start in the upper echelons, presents a more gradual increase from that point. American Revolt is of an older style that presumes if a player is willing to spend time on expansion content, they must already be a big fan and therefore well versed enough with the base game that the expansion can push the difficulty up several notches. Set after the base game, with the player's corporation having taken control of the whole world, the expansion posits that the entirety of North and South America threw off the yoke of your corporation's oppression at once, and it's your job to bring them back into the fold. The 21 new missions all reuse the same maps as the base game, but with new enemy compositions and objectives. You start out with 8 fully upgraded agents, a huge pile of cash with more arriving from your territory constantly, and all the equipment from the base game, with only 2 new weapons available for research. This should prepare you for how difficult the missions are going to be, but it won't prepare you to actually beat those missions. The levels in American Revolt start harder than the base game's Atlantic Accelerator, and presumably get harder from there. I wouldn't know, I couldn't beat a single one. Each level starts you with only moments before your squad or the objectives there to defend are set upon by hordes of heavily armed, heavily augmented enemy agents. I like tactics games, though as will likely be apparent by the end of this video, I am very bad at them. I don't think that's why I can't make it through a single level of American Revolt though. Each feels like it expects a specific reaction, to abuse a certain aspect of the game's design to succeed. It feels more like a puzzle to be solved than a tactical situation to be overcome. In the base game, a 4-man squad of upgraded minigunners could get you through most situations, but you could deal with those missions other ways too. In Revolt, it feels like there's probably only 1 or 2 strategies that will get you through a level, and I'm not nearly well versed enough in the intricacies of Syndicate's mechanics to figure out what they might be. I don't think it's difficult because of the complex situations it puts you in, it's difficult because those situations overwhelm you and leave you horribly outmatched with little time or room to maneuver your agents. It won't be the last game in this video I fail to complete, but I can't imagine anyone but the most invested players of Syndicate to make their way through it. Despite only being released 3 years later, Syndicate Wars represents a huge step forward over the original game. Design elements across the board are tightened and polished, giving the entire thing the sense of being something closer to what the developers originally intended. One of the most impactful changes is also the most immediately obvious. Using the technology developed for their hybrid flight sim/god game Magic Carpet means that while the characters are still represented by sprite work, the environments are now fully 3D. This greatly improves some of the readability issues that the original had by allowing the full rotation of the environments. It also means that since you can now rotate obstacles out of view, the cities you visit are more able to incorporate far taller buildings, which, combined with the darker colour palette, does a much better job of evoking an oppressive and grim atmosphere. It's a tad more generic in its way. The more colourful and vibrant city blocks of the first game certainly aren't a traditional rendition of a futuristic city, but despite being less original, it feels more in keeping with the tone the game is going for. Along with these improvements to visibility are navigational improvements. Pathfinding seems far more reliable this time around, but navigation is improved greatly with the simple addition of feedback on the location you've ordered your agents towards. It's a tiny change, but it makes moving your units feel so much more responsive. Just the little extra feedback of an icon appearing eliminates the uncertainty of whether you and your agents agree on where you just sent them, or that you told them to go anywhere at all. The controls overall are a huge improvement. The default scheme is still a tad clunky for modern sensibilities, but there are far more actions assigned hotkeys, allowing you far smoother and more rapid control of your squad with one minor exception. Grouping has been replaced with following. You can be more specific with it, allowing you to gather your whole team at once or split them into 2 or 3 squads, but you can only give commands to the leader, and the others will trail behind on a slight delay. This is a very minor change, but it has some significant ramifications when it comes to tactical engagements that need to be accounted for. The tactical situations confronting you have a great deal more variety this time around. Missions are more structured. Still set in large open city blocks, but you're more likely to trigger specific events throughout the course of your missions. Reaching a certain point or completing a certain objective may trigger the introduction of new units or even vehicles, requiring you to be much more reactive to the changing circumstances of a mission. At least the first time around. Since these always trigger in the same way, repeating missions with foreknowledge of a specific ambush will be easier the second time around when you're prepared for what your enemy has in store. The basic concepts of the underlying system remains the same, but there have been some significant changes. Ammo is now functionally infinite, instead limited by the use of regenerating power bar, which has ramifications on the weapon's balance and usage. Since ammo is no longer a limiting resource, it encourages using your more exotic equipment, but as more powerful weapons will drain an agent's power quicker, it discourages you from equipping your entire squad with the most powerful weapons at once, or you will risk being left defenseless. The drugs have also been simplified. Instead of 3 bars each indicating different attributes, you're limited to a single bar. Push it into the red and your troops will more quickly target enemies, push it blue and they'll attack anyone on sight. Meanwhile, leaving it in the middle and they'll only shoot what you tell them to. The reduction in possibilities is a disappointment, but the simplicity of the system makes it much easier to use, and the rate at which your agents acclimatise to the changes has slowed dramatically, making it a lot more convenient to leave agents in one state or the other for Overwatch purposes. Using your agents tactically is a lot more important this time around for 2 reasons. First of all, the improved pathfinding and more reactive NPCs make the enemy a lot more difficult to cheese. It's now much harder to hide around a corner with a Persuadertron and clep entire squads of enemy agents. They're also much tougher this time around, due to changes in the energy shields. Instead of a piece of equipment, they're standard issue hardware everyone has now, a basic recharging shield on top of your regular health pool for both you and your enemies. The major shift, however, is that while the shield is up, a unit is immune to being stunned from damage. This is good for the player since it stops you from getting your entire squad wiped by an accidental stunlock, and the buffer stops long missions being quite such a trial of attrition as your mistakes slowly accumulate on your health bar. But at the same time, it means luring your enemies into choke points and locking them down with minigun fire is no longer a surefire strategy. Large groups of enemies are now far more serious threats and require a more careful approach, which combined with the addition of more complex units such as highly durable vehicles, results in the game being far more difficult than its predecessor. So difficult in fact that I was unable to beat the game. As I alluded to earlier, I have an incurable case of stupid dumb idiots disease, and I'm not great at these kinds of tactical games, especially under the pressure of a real-time system, but for Syndicate Wars that only makes up about half the reason I couldn't complete it. The other half is due to the changes to the strategic layer. The original games was deceptively low pressure. It wasn't too hard to gain enough money to keep your research ticking over, and researching order didn't matter too much since you could always try another mission or just wait out the timers. In Wars, the management of your squad is made more difficult, to the point that it reintroduces the problem I thought I would have with the original. Money and research no longer increase in the management menus, only after missions does research advance, which can lead you to having a technology almost complete, but requiring an entire mission to finish it. The number of scientists you have also affects the speed you can research, with you gaining scientists from persuading them during missions. But these are a limited resource, not a general background element that you can acquire along the way, but only appearing as objectives during certain missions. Worse still, there's a baffling mechanic where they can just die on you. There's a random chance scientists will die performing research, leaving you short-staffed. Since you can't reliably recuperate the numbers, you can, through no fault of your own, end up losing a huge chunk of your research division, hamstringing your progress throughout the rest of the game. You can't even make do with stealing equipment while out in the field, since any weapon you've yet to research has a chance to misfire and wipe out your agent's entirely weapons energy bar in one shot, making on-site procurement almost useless. I say almost because you still want to be grabbing every enemy weapon you can and kidnapping large numbers of civilians at the same time because of the second major change to the strategic layer. You no longer have any passive income. Selling equipment or getting a small boost from anyone you've controlled at the end of a mission are ways to gain a little cash here and there, but the primary means of funding your operation is bank robbery. In various missions there will be banks you can blow up and steal from. These are mission specific, however, and since you can't replay missions, this means the vast majority of the money you might have access to is a limited resource, as in limited across your entire playthrough. If you miss a bank because you couldn't hit it and complete your objective, or didn't realise there was one in that mission at all, or you did but you couldn't afford or find the explosives to bring the building down, you've missed out on that particular windfall for the rest of the game. In theory, this stops you from amassing a huge amount of wealth early on and equipping a maxed out squad with ease, but in practice it discourages the kinds of experimentation that the tactical gameplay thrives on. You don't have the luxury of trying out different equipment builds, or even equipping your squad too heavily at all, since you don't necessarily know when you're going to be getting more money, and losing a heavily armed squad member may be an unrecoverable financial burden. This, combined with the slower pace of research, puts a real dampener on the management layer for me. I wanted to be able to experiment and try out all the different weapons. Wars has a far larger arsenal than its predecessor, and the power curve is stretched out across the entire game much better. Growing from Uzis and rifles at the start, to satellites that can drop tungsten rods from orbit and demolish multiple blocks of the now fully destructible cities towards the end. The variety is far greater, as is the impact they can have on a mission, but you're discouraged from experimenting too much since your time and money, and therefore research budget, are limited. This is what happened to me in the end. I recognise some people enjoy a more impactful strategic layer, where mistakes early can have repercussions for later in a playthrough, but I personally hate it. I don't hugely appreciate having to repeat large chunks of content, so I'm not particularly fond of finding out that decisions I made were wrong and I need to replay the entire game to get back to where I was, but with the right equipment this time. Ultimately, I made it about halfway through the Eurocorp campaign before I found missions were becoming a slog. I was struggling with the ramping up of the number of vehicles I was facing, and the only way I had to deal with them was to know they were coming in advance and then pop in and out of a building taking potshots at them while waiting for my shields to recharge. In order to reliably tackle these vehicles, I would likely have needed access to ion mines, but since the missions take place in a more linear order, only occasionally giving you a few missions to choose between, I wasn't able to try something else till that research was complete. I would have had to restart the entire game, playing through several hours again just to get back with different equipment that would hopefully help me take on the challenge. I like the game, it's good, but I wasn't willing to do that, especially since there was the distinct possibility it would just happen again further down the line, so I gave up instead. I don't want to sound like I'm knocking the game for this, mind you. I'm personally not fond of these mechanics that can render hours of gameplay obsolete, but I know others are far more into it. People enjoy the feeling of having a large, complex puzzle to solve across multiple playthroughs, but while I do very much enjoy the moment-to-moment gameplay of Syndicate Wars, I don't have the patience to replay it until I work out the correct order to complete my research in. That said, I should also remind you that I am a stupid idiot who is bad at strategy and tactics games, despite enjoying them. I can't wholly blame not finishing the game on my failure to research optimally, because my playthrough of the Church of the New Epoch also ended in much the same way. There's a much stronger focus on narrative this time around. Instead of simply painting the map for your chosen side, there's an actual story going on driving the missions, with 2 campaigns from which to follow it. Broadly speaking, following the first game, Eurocorp took control of the entire world. Within Eurocorp, a group developed made up of 10 researchers referred to as the C3. They were working on a way to enhance human intelligence beyond the capabilities of the AIs that currently run the world, and recently succeeded. Their leader, Visick, was presumably killed in an explosion shortly before the game starts, but the remaining researchers named themselves the Nine and founded the Church of the New Epoch, and aimed to use it, along with the technology their enhanced intelligence allows them to construct, to usurp Eurocorp's control of the world. The plot from either side kicks off with the releasing of the Harbinger virus into Eurocorp's network. This brings down most of the world's AIs, disconnecting many citizens from the Utopia chips that alter their view of reality and help keep them under Eurocorp's control. Despite having 2 campaigns with 2 different mission sets, the narrative is more or less the same from both sides. In each, you gradually work your way through missions, defeating the smaller syndicates that form in the wake of Eurocorp's fracturing, confronting the population of disconnected citizens, named the Unguided, who have rallied behind the very much alive Visick to try and oppose the other 2 factions, before the Nine reveal their ultimate plan to run away to the moon, use an experimental device there to wipe out all life on the planet, and then reseed it with clones of themselves. Naturally, either being a Eurocorp lackey or a church acolyte who decided they don't actually fancy the idea of being sacrificed along with the rest of the planet, it's up to you to stop them. It's a relatively basic plot, told entirely through the pre-mission briefings, so characters are minimised in the interest of events. The few characters that are present are usually there as objectives. Each side has an operative that'll eventually betray them. Each needs to fight over a specific researcher. It's interesting getting to rescue someone as Eurocorp who was kidnapped off screen, later to get to play through that kidnapping as the Church, but despite the crossover and similarities, the 2 plots are mutually exclusive, instead of cohering into 2 perspectives of a single narrative. The fact that both campaigns play so similarly could have been interesting. The structure of the campaigns and the kinds of missions you take on are the same in each, with the only difference really being some aesthetic and tonal differences. Eurocorp's mission briefings are more professional, while the Churches invoke more spiritual language, but the messages being conveyed are fundamentally the same. Each side believes they should be in power and the other should not. The contrasts and comparisons between corporate and religious organisations could have been ripe territory for social commentary and complex storytelling. The way each uses hierarchical structures to both control its members and distribute power, the financial incentives that each have used and benefited from over the years, the way each uses that power to influence both its own members and the world at large, the way each purports to answer to a higher power, gods and shareholders respectively, though at least there's no Epicurean paradox when it comes to shareholders because we can be pretty sure that they're no good. Especially the way that while religious power remains an influential factor in the modern age, corporate power is gradually taking over in terms of importance and control in the lives of everyday people. It all has the potential of a complex commentary on the nature and structure of these organisations, and how they impact the world and societies within it, but any direct commentary of this nature is absent, and it's more likely that the similarities between the two factions are a result of the production schedule rather than any deliberate choice. There's strong indications that the factions playing the same was not the game's original intention. There was planned to be a third campaign, the final being playing as the Unguided, guided by Visick, which seemed to focus on weaker agents but having more support from other units around the map. This would seem to suggest that the Church and Eurocorp were also meant to be mechanically distinct, with the Church fielding more high-tech equipment but having harder access to funds and researchers, while Eurocorp have more resources but weaker equipment. This never came to be in the final game, leaving any cutting social commentary on the similarities of religious and corporate organisations as an unintended side effect. Which is a shame since cyberpunk as a subgenre has always been fertile ground for social commentary, a fact that only becomes more true as the years pass by. As much as I like the original Syndicate, it's far easier to recommend Wars to a modern audience. As a sequel, it feels like a more focused attempt to recreate the intent of the original, with the benefit of hindsight and improved technology elevating it to a more cohesive work. It would have been nice to see what the team could have produced with further refinements, but it wasn't to be. Bullfrog had been acquired by Electronic Arts the year prior, and gradually in the years following, key figures would start to leave the company or found their own studios. Eventually, Bullfrog would be completely merged into EA. This would leave the Syndicate series dormant for over a decade, and when it returned, it would do so radically changed. EA would hand the series over to Starbreeze Studios, a Swedish developer previously known for their work on the Chronicles of Riddick games, to develop a first-person shooter based on and in the world of Syndicate. This came as a disappointment to many, as 18 years had passed since Wars, and getting a game in a completely different genre wasn't exactly what people were hoping for. To add insult to injury, XCOM had faced a similar situation when 2K Games had announced an action-focused reboot of that series, only to then release the very well-received XCOM Enemy Unknown instead, an excellent modernisation of what made the original game so beloved. That action-focused rendition of XCOM would later be released as The Bureau XCOM Declassified, but Syndicate would face no such luck. EA announced an FPS, and then they released the FPS, with no tactical or strategic recreation of the originals in sight. I understand the disappointment in the 2012 release of Syndicate, but at the same time I think it's unfair to the development team behind the work. Syndicate 2012 isn't the game anyone really wanted, but a lot of hard work goes into creating even disappointing works, so it's still worth examining both in its own right and as to how they tried to tie it into the games that had come before it. It's clear the developers were fans of the earlier games, despite the huge shift in mechanical focus. You're inundated with collectible logs throughout the game, filling out a rather extensive codex of world building. A lot of this is based upon the earlier games. A lot of it is also new, but throughout the various dossiers detailing corporate backgrounds, subsidiaries and key figures are corporations and characters from the earlier games, or described in their manuals, though without the underlying sense of humour that Bullfrog were known for. Visick appears as a passing mention, a key researcher who recently died during a terrorist strike at the C3 conference in Reykjavik, and in fact the Church of the New Epoch is seen as a quiet organisation slowly building support amongst the lower classes. It doesn't directly place itself as a game set during or between the earlier games, but it's clearly drawing its world building from there, making the game feel like a serious attempt to develop a coherent setting out of background information and descriptions in the manuals of the older games. There's some narrative in these logs too. In addition to the general information about technology and corporate groups, are news bulletins and communications between individuals, which often connect with one another, creating micro-narratives within and between levels. The attempts to build a large and detailed world beyond what the player will interact with reminds me of Mirror's Edge Catalyst in a lot of ways, which is an interesting coincidence since Syndicate is connected to that series in another way. It uses the same lighting solution that made the original Mirror's Edge such a timelessly gorgeous game. That lighting system isn't used to quite as good effect in Syndicate. The environments are more detailed and busy, which leads to the lighting, impressive though it is at times, to take a back seat to the other visual elements going on in the game. The other problem is that everything looks washed out. I wouldn't normally comment on something so minor, but it really undersells the visual design of the world. Somewhere between the low white point and bloom, there's a distinct lack of contrast to the game's appearance, which results in the game looking far more dull than it deserves to. It's an easy enough fix. Using something like Reshade to boost the contrast of the game and tweak the colour grading turns Syndicate into an amazing display of environmental design, but as it released, it ends up feeling kind of drab. This doesn't help the slightly generic nature of the world itself. Beautiful though it is, it's nothing super original, and it suffers greatly from the different environments not doing enough to differentiate themselves from one another. The 3 different corporate compounds you get to fight your way through are all visually impressive, but the environments and security guarding them look far too similar. It's a shame that so much work was put into developing the backstory of these groups without doing enough to make them visually distinct from one another. There are narrative elements that inform the visual design here and there. A corporation focused on dominance within the transport industry has its own floating city that you get to fight through, while the others both sequester all of their business and employees into massive skyscrapers, a change allowed by the new first-person perspective that doubles as an excuse to limit your progression to linear corridors and arenas. Meanwhile, the lower classes struggle to get by in the streets far below. Each of the areas you visit are narratively justified, often in interesting ways, but it's difficult to tell at a glance that the areas are being held by different corporations. The game tends towards a much brighter tone than the earlier ones. It's mostly clean offices and public spaces, with the grimier run-down urban areas saved for a brief section spent fighting at ground level, and this is due to the one major narrative change I'm not a fan of. The Utopia chip of the earlier games is now the Dart chip. In the originals, the chip was used not just as a direct method of control, but also indirectly, by altering citizens' perceptions of the world, making Detroit seem like a quaint European town, as per Syndicate Wars' introductory cutscene. Now the Dart chip is simply a method of connecting to the corporate network, and for your agent a method of justifying their various combat abilities. This is disappointing because it's one of the few areas where the narrative components of the earlier games could have made a real impact on the mechanically distinct new formula. The concept of your agent having a chip in his head that alters his perception of reality is something that could have been played with and created a fascinating bridge between the earlier games and the modern presentation. The perception-altering possibilities of the Utopia chip in first person could have made for connective tissue between the narrative components of the original game and the mechanical changes in the new, but unfortunately that opportunity was missed. The only perceptual impact the Dart chip has on the world are icons that float above boxes and chairs to inform you that it is in fact a chair or a box. Good job, Eurocorp. That's $1 trillion of research and development well spent. Despite the clear amount of effort put in by the development team to connect the new games to the narrative elements of the earlier work, Syndicate was never a series driven by its narrative engagement. Its primary draw was a mechanically distinct experience, and so the mechanical shifts to a first-person shooter massively damages its connections to the earlier work, and I feel mechanical implementation of the narrative Utopia chip could have connected the distinct mechanical experiences far better than a slew of references hidden away in collectible documents does. But despite its disconnect from the originals, the mechanical components of Starbreeze's Syndicate are decent in their own right. It's not world-shattering, but it's a solid first-person shooter. Decently paced from an encounter perspective, never going too long without switching it up with new enemies or equipment to play with, and some of the set pieces are impressive. It's a decently fun romp through some gorgeous environments, with some fun gear to play with, and the aforementioned dart chip adds just enough to the moment-to-moment combat to make it feel distinct. The time dilation with X-ray vision is frequently useful, while its other abilities are helpful for levelling the playing field when outnumbered, forcing enemies to set off their own grenades, turning them into your own allies briefly, or disabling several of their weapons. Your powers refill based on your own combat, with the whole system encouraging an aggressive playstyle, taking out large groups with your skills, then recharging them by pushing forwards in the aftermath. There's potential for impressive tactical uses, which will be an important point later, but the most disappointing aspect is that the most interesting abilities are held exclusively by your enemies. The boss fights throughout the game tend to be the weakest encounters, since they each exhibit unique abilities that not only require a specific approach to defeat, but also make you wish that you could play with that too. They aren't terrible. Fighting a guy who can teleport short distances and make clones of himself, or hacking micro-missiles back and forth like explosive tennis is fun, but it always leaves you with the sense that, despite being told your equipment is state-of-the-art, you could be playing with more fun toys. And I could definitely have done without the dubstep. There are moments throughout that do feel like playing as one of the agents you were controlling in the earlier games, especially when the game hands you a minigun and lets you tear through an environment, pushing to your objectives civilian casualties be damned, which are certainly more brutal than their overhead renditions, but even then the game doesn't ever do anything particularly surprising from a mechanical perspective. Overall, the gameplay is well made, but it's also very safe. Between the civilian casualties and hacking enemies' brains to force them to commit suicide, the game maintains its predecessor's disregard for individual life. The perspective shift does make that a more intense element of the presentation, but despite this potentially uncomfortable subject matter, the gameplay isn't trying to rock the boat in any way. There's nothing here that you won't have seen in other games before or since. It's simply an overall solid rendition of those things, and the narrative proves to be much the same. Unless it's your first day on Earth, you probably won't be surprised by any of the plot twists the game throws at you. Would you be surprised to find that Dr. Drool, who the script is keen to remind you is a hot lady, is secretly sympathetic to the lower classes and is working to help them? Would you be surprised to learn that your CEO, voiced by Brian Cox, is secretly evil alongside your gravelly voiced fellow agent who casually executes civilians? Would you be surprised that by the end you've switched sides to help Dr. Drool fight against Brian Cox? No, of course not. The narrative moves along steadily, taking even fewer risks than the combat, and it's also where the pacing issues enter the frame. The narrative ends up feeling both rushed and slow-paced. Each mission you're sent on takes place across multiple levels and are decently long, but there's only really 4 sections of the game. First, you're sent to execute a rival scientist, then you're sent to tail Dr. Drool and rescue her when she's kidnapped by rival syndicates, then you chase her through the slums before being betrayed and finally fighting your way up the Eurocorp skyscraper to murder your ex-boss. The slums are an effective sequence, trading small groups of elite enemies for large groups of weaker refugees, immune to some of your abilities due to their lack of chips. Mechanically, it's a good switch-up, introducing an engaging change at a good time in the playthrough without outstaying its welcome, but narratively it's the end of your second mission for Eurocorp and the final one before your betrayal. The game could have done with breaking its levels up into more missions. Even if those missions had been more generic and had less to do with the overarching narrative, it would have made the progression of time feel more authentic. As it is, you go from the corporation's cutting-edge new Golden Boy to Public Enemy number 1 and assaulting their global headquarters single-handedly in the space of a long weekend. None of which is helped by the main character's status as a silent protagonist. It never feels like you're making any decisions. Even when switching sides, you're just doing what you're told, just being told by a different person. The game even ends trying to make a point about your character's agency. Drool apologises for using you to fight against Eurocorp and asks what you'll do now, but since you've never shown any indication you wanted to think for yourself in the first place, it falls flat. The one-man assault aspect is also one of its weakest elements. You're introduced to fellow agent Merritt early on, and are sent on both of your corporate missions with him, but he's only present during narrative segments, never during actual gameplay. The 4-man squads of the earlier games never materialise, except in the final boss fight against Merritt, where he's the one who has backup. The game would have really benefited from some friendly NPCs to fight alongside to help you feel more like a squad from the earlier games, and this is evidenced by one of my favourite sequences in the game. On the surface, it's a pretty basic fight along a vertically layered corridor, but you've got a drone fighting alongside you. The very basic addition of a second gun covering your back as you're attacked from multiple angles really enhances the gameplay and makes it feel like the mechanical toolset you're given is missing something when you're on your own. This is what makes the circumstances of 2012 Syndicate's release so aggravating. As is becoming a trend in this video, I didn't complete all of Syndicate 2012, but this time it's not my fault at all. The game is no longer available for purchase, having been delisted in 2020 due to an issue with the game's DRM, but even if you buy a second-hand copy or acquire a copy from the peg-legged mafia, you only have access to about 2/3 of the game. The servers for its co-op mode have long since been shut down, leaving no way to access it without bodging together your own emulated private server. This removes access to an entirely separate co-op campaign. The 4-player co-op campaign not only features 9 additional missions, but a wider variety of abilities, loadout customization, and the honest-to-god return of the research system via XP unlocks for equipment. While the single player is solid, it seems like hidden within Syndicate 2012 is a genuinely good co-op shooter, where the introduction of more tactical usage of a wider variety of skills and equipment feels more in line with the earlier games, but it's no longer accessible. Syndicate's reboot certainly isn't a bad game. It tries its best to integrate the narrative elements of the series, but it was never going to scratch the same mechanical itch as the originals. It doesn't deserve the hate it got, but it's definitely not the game the fans of the originals wanted, and I share that feeling. Though I enjoyed my time with it, I would have preferred that the series continued in the same way XCOM did, with a faithful modernisation, but there's not a whole lot I can do about that. The same can't be said for Mike Diskett. Mike Diskett worked as the producer for the DOS version of Syndicate Wars, as well as working as a programmer on the Amiga port of the original Syndicate. Like many others, he was disappointed to see the new release being such a departure from what made the original special, but unlike many others, he was in a position to do something about it. Mike founded 5 Live Studios, alongside 4 other veteran developers he had worked with previously, and set about working on a new game. Funded via a Kickstarter campaign, in 2015 they released Stallite Reign. There's no question the game deserves its spot alongside the originals. It's every bit the updated and modernised rendition of the original ideas that 2012's XCOM was for its series. Unlike that game, however, it makes enough changes to feel like a distinct work as well, beyond simply being a refresh of the old formula. There's an argument to be made that the modern XCOM games make the originals somewhat redundant. So faithful are they in recreating the original feel, there's little reason to return to the earlier works, and even if you miss the relative levels of complexity, there's always Xenonauts. Stallite Reign doesn't do that for Syndicate and its sequel. The changes made to modernise the formula shift it in directions that wouldn't have been possible at the time of the originals, which also means that those original, more action-focused experiences are still worth going back for. The most obvious changes are actually the least impactful. Stallite Reign takes place in an open world, with missions being set within the various compounds and restricted areas scattered across its 4 districts. Progression is gated between districts, but as you unlock them you're free to tackle those objectives in any order, or return to finish them later. There's a reasonable amount of aesthetic variety between the districts. The smoggy industrial zone feels distinct from the high-tech grid district, but the return to a mostly fixed camera angle does limit the world's capacity for verticality. The effect ends up feeling halfway between the 2 originals. It feels like a vast cohesive city like in Wars, but maintains the seeming lack of high-rise buildings that the original had. Impressively though, despite the fixed camera, there weren't many issues with your view being blocked. The world is designed with the fixed angle in mind. This combination of freeing up your view of the screen without the structure of the districts and compounds ever feeling contrived is an impressive feat. The open approach to objectives and the order you tackle them is definitely a positive, but otherwise the open world is somewhat underutilised. There's ATMs to hack for funds and random patrols to kidnap for clones, but otherwise it's mostly an area to keep your agents while you plan your approach to each objective. These structural changes are the most immediately obvious shifts to the formula of the original, but besides the sense of narrowing the scope of the game's focus to a single city, they don't have nearly as much impact on the experience as the more mechanical changes do. The originals were very much tactical action games, but the emphasis was often on the action, whereas here the focus is very much more upon the tactics. Control of your team is more akin to a traditional real-time strategy, complete with custom grouping and hotkeys for almost every ability at their disposal. This makes precision execution of your plans far simpler, but at the same time, that precision changes the feel of the originals. For example, in the originals your agents would shoot at your mouse cursor when you told them to do so, whereas here you tell them to target enemies in much the same way you might in StarCraft. This makes your squad feel more like an elite group of operatives, rather than the uncoordinated rabble of thugs randomly spraying minigun fire down crowded streets of the original. These changes are fascinating since, seen side by side, Stallite Reign plays very differently from the originals, and yet it feels very much in step with them. The general fantasy of controlling an elite squad of corporate agents is maintained, but the concept of what that means has shifted in the years since the originals, due to technological improvements as much as changing tastes. This is what allows the game to feel like an authentic modernisation of the originals, without feeling like it makes them redundant. It's a modern take on the original idea, rather than an attempt to recreate the original game to modern tastes, leading it to feel faithful to the originals while still feeling original in its own right. The game has a more stealth-focused approach to much of it. This is true whether or not you have the optional uber damage mode enabled, which triples damage across the board. It's not necessarily more difficult, rather it alters which tactics are most effective. Without it, everyone is rather spongy, which gives you plenty of time to make decisions and lets your agents hold their ground easily, but makes it difficult to take out enemies before they call in reinforcements. Conversely, with damage increased, ambushes are far more effective, and it's easier to take down small groups of enemies quickly, but when things get loud, they go to hell quickly, and you can wipe your entire squad with just one or two mistakes. Based on how I enjoyed playing, I found the latter to be more satisfying, though I did have to use another custom mode to bring it back down to a manageable pace for me. Real time with pause mode is a lie, but it's a reasonable concession to give the player a little extra breathing room at times. It doesn't let you completely pause the game, just slow it greatly, and it's not infinite either, rather it drains the enemy of one of your agents. This is because it doesn't actually make any changes to the way the game plays, it just starts your support agent with its times slow skill maxed out. The separation of your 4 agents into 4 different classes has one of the biggest impacts on growing the tactical variety available to the player. The soldier, support, hacker, and infiltrator all have unique skills that you can put experience into as the game progresses, but importantly, there's only a few things each can do that the others can't. While your agent's skills make them more suitable for specific roles, you can further customize them with various augmentations and gear to fill any role. For example, your soldier can equip heavy weapons without a penalty to their speed or accuracy, but with the right leg and arm augmentations, your other 3 are just as effective. It's just that your soldier can do it while still having those gear slots open for other purposes. Anyone can hack as well as your hacker can with the proxy hacker gear, but you lose that gear slot that might be useful for something else. If you want a stealthy hacker, you can either give your infiltrator or proxy hacker, or your hacker a stealth generator, allowing them to cloak in a way that the infiltrator can naturally. There's a huge amount of variety in the gear and augmentations you can equip your squad with, but you'll always have a baseline group that can do a bit of everything. The question is how you specialise them for your playstyle. It's a great system that encourages experimentation and variety, often making it worthwhile to equip and re-equip your team as the mission requires. The variety in approaches to missions is slightly undercut by the lack of variety in those actual missions. There are some variations, some assassination missions out in the open world for example, but the vast majority of your objectives are to reach a specific building within a compound. Each district has a few different restricted areas, usually a bank, security centre and guard post, which are simpler areas with a single objective. Get one of your agents, or a specific agent, into the marked building to get more money from ATM hacks, or increase camera alarm and reinforcement response times. They're simple enough, and you usually want to get them out of the way before tackling the district's major areas. Larger, more complex compounds with 2 or 3 locations you need to get into. Sometimes it's get in and out, other times you need to escort an NPC into or out of them, but it's always reaching a specific point on the map. Fortunately, there's a huge amount of variety of challenges between you and your targets. Security doors, vents, ziplines, turrets, patrols, all sorts of complexities with various ways around them. Cameras can be temporarily disabled from a connected security station, or permanently disabled by destroying or disabling the power supply. Doors can be hacked to give you access, hardwired open briefly, disabled entirely in an open or closed state, blown up, bypassed, or you can hijack a guard to open it for you. There's a great deal of possibilities in approaching any given objective, and adapting to missions on the fly, deciding whether to cut your losses having reached one or trying to hit another one in the same compound is hugely engaging. You usually receive prototypes from reaching these locations, which let you research them to produce more, but only if you can get them out safely. Only the agent carrying them needs to get out safely, mind you. The rest are more or less expendable, which is handy if you need them to hold off the recently alerted garrison while you escape with the loot. Death is forgiving, in fact much of the de-emphasised strategic layer is. Money comes in at a constant tick as you hack ATMs around the map, with larger lump sums paid out for completing various missions, but even if you run out you can just wait for more to come in. Resurrecting your agents costs money depending on their equipment, but this decreases over time, so unless you need to drop them right back into the fight you can wait until it's free. The system gives you a huge amount of leeway, which may be disappointing for some, but for someone with all the tactical grace of a cat stealing your chicken nuggets, it's a great relief being able to take a few shots at something before success. More than a few of my tactical incursions ended in my infiltrator fleeing for her life, while my remaining 3 agents heroically sacrificed their lives holding off reinforcements. It makes the game significantly easier to get through for the average player, while still allowing skilled players to excel by acing the missions with no deaths or even alerts. In my mind, that's a great improvement. It means that succeeding by the skin of your teeth is still a success, and isn't going to doom you to restart your whole game several hours down the line. One way you are slightly punished for death is by degrading the stats of your agent's clones, but you can always get more. You do so by hijacking enemies. Like in previous games, your hacker can persuade people over to your side, almost any enemy if their hijack skill is high enough, and these can be sent back to the lab to act as the basis of your agent's clones, providing bonuses to health and speed amongst a variety of other stats. While they're under your control though, you can also use them just as you would one of your agents. You are limited in number, there's no hijacking an entire city block like old times. At max level you can only have 5 at once, and your hacker takes a major hit to their energy regeneration for the privilege, but that's also an entire extra squad that you can control, just like your regular agents. This further enhances the tactical flexibility you have available to you. No longer confined to just having a cloud of meat shields following you, you're now able to have enemies open doors for you, create diversions, or simply act as extra firepower in a fight. Sending a squad of civilians to set off the alarm at one entrance, drawing the enemy patrols away from your squad infiltrating from the other side of the compound, or sending an enemy commander deep into their facility only to drop a grenade next to the power generator for all the base's security turrets. These kinds of options are open to you throughout. There's a huge number of approaches to any objective, stealthy or loud, clever or straightforward, where in the first game you were basically fine to simply wander around with miniguns most of the time, and in wars it often felt like the missions had specific approaches in mind that you needed to puzzle out. Here, the sheer breadth and variety of the ways you can approach any given situation opens the way for a huge amount of tactical variety and creativity in approach. One area that hasn't developed much since the originals, however, is the plot. Stallite Reign sits somewhere between the original and Wars in terms of complexity. The narrative components are little more than something to string together all your heists. A company called Dracogenics and their CEO Dengler have developed resurrection technology, allowing them to trade immortality for complete control of the city. Your corporation has managed to bodge together a similar system, allowing your agents to respawn, but they'd really appreciate controlling the real thing. In that interest, you've been sent into the city with your agents to install a virus at Dracogenics headquarters that will transfer control of the system to your side. From there, it's just a question of gearing up and making your way through the districts until you're ready for the final confrontation. There's a few wrinkles along the way. Each district you enter adds a little more, but never changing the overarching narrative. First, it turns out there's a problem with the virus and your handler needs to get someone to fix it. Later, it turns out the only way to upload the fixed virus is to piggyback it on someone who has admin access to the existing system, which means uploading it alongside Dengler's consciousness. All of that's going on in the background, however. Despite the written logs and communications you can pick up around the city and the variety of flavor text for mission objectives, your primary concern is improving your gear and agents before the final confrontation. Like the originals, the game is far more concerned with its mechanical engagement than its world building or narrative, which is why it's kind of impressive that it manages to absolutely nail its ending. Every other game in the series just kind of peters out at the end. The original simply adding credits to its mission complete scene, wars with a brief text screen about how you won. Even the reboot ended on a decided anticlimax, but Stallite Reign ends with an incredibly memorable middle finger to the player. The final encounter with Dengler is great, a complex area with a huge number of enemies. You need to kill Dengler 3 times for it to stick, and you need to get an agent over to him to execute him each time to make sure it sticks, so you can't just sit back and snipe him. The escalation is dramatic, a hectic and excellent test of your skills up until now, though I'll admit in my case, the experience was slightly undercut by my incompetence, having to respawn my own squad several times before I finally put the CEA down for the last time. After this, you're left to watch your squad fight off the remaining enemies. Your handler's elation that the plan worked quickly turns to anger as she realises the person she got to fix the virus has taken control of the Resurrection satellites herself, which then turns to panic as she realises what she's going to do with them. There's nothing to do but watch as the satellites fall from the sky, cutting out your handler's audio as one hits her district, watching the security cameras blink out one by one across the city as they're annihilated, before finally the arena you're in is bathed in light and the signal is lost. It's not your day, but it is a hell of an ending, memorable and unexpected, but fitting in its way. I was expecting a simple congratulations, you won, but that's hardly fitting given that you aren't exactly the good guy in all of this. Your problem isn't that Dengler has control over life and death and gets to trade immortality to whomsoever he chooses in exchange for ultimate power. The problem is you don't. The citizens of the city may have been dealt a bum hand by having dozens of satellites dropped on them, but you and Dengler got exactly what you deserved. I wouldn't have it any other way. It was disappointing when Syndicate 2012 didn't continue in the mechanical footsteps of its predecessors, but people often forget that a name means very little. The world isn't yet such a corporate dystopia that smaller groups can't have an impact, and Stallite Reign does more than enough to maintain the legacy of the original games. Bullfrog had a major impact on the game industry, but it's true a lot of their games were strange hybrid pieces that are niche in the modern age. 5 Live Studio wouldn't be the first to attempt to take the legacy of their games into their own hands, and they haven't been the last. Fans of the Dungeon Keeper's games would go on to develop War for the Overworld in 2013, and in 2016 Two Point Studios would be founded by other Bullfrog alumni to develop a series of spiritual successors to Theme Hospital. There's often outcry when large corporations supposedly ruin franchises by releasing entries that disappoint their fans, but if the will is there, then nothing stops smaller studios from building works that fulfill the same niche. It's only the branding that is lost to the IP dungeons, and it's rarely branding that makes a game special. Thanks for watching.